So nice knowing you're here tonight. The evening stretches out around us.
Ồ, ở đằng kia kìa.
There's comfort in knowing you set
Giờ thì
aside
ta đã
this
thấy
time.
rồi.
This time was made to feel less alone. The night is settling in now. The air has that stillness to it. The day has finished most of its business. The world is ready to rest. Tonight we'll ease back into Milford Junction. The town never asks much. The evening answers kindly. We'll spend time with folks who go about their routines. Quiet routines that need no hurrying. They watch clouds drift overhead. They tend to small tasks. These are gentle little moments. They don't rush their way through. They're waiting for us now. Let me dim this light for you. Your eyes can relax. After a bit, the screen will fade. It'll fade out completely. So get settled where you are. Let the day fall back a step. Let it fall back just a little more. Your breathing can smooth out now. Your body can rest naturally. The night knows how to carry things from here. Milford Junction sits quietly in the country. It's not quite on the way to anywhere, but somehow it's exactly where it needs to be. The streets are lined with maple trees. Those trees have been growing for generations. Their branches reach over sidewalks. They reach over driveways, too. They're like old friends leaning in, old friends sharing a quiet secret. The houses are mostly older. They have porches that wrap around corners. The windows catch the light just so. They make you want to sit and watch. Watch for a good long while. In the evenings, the town changes. It takes on a particular quality. Hard to describe, but easy to feel. The sounds of the day fade away. The lawn mowers go quiet. The car doors stop closing. Children stop calling to each other. What replaces them is softer, much softer. It feels like the town itself is settling into a comfortable chair, letting out a long, slow breath. A very slow breath. The light changes too. It shifts from bright afternoon clarity. It becomes something warmer, something more golden. The shadows stretch longer across the grass. The sky turns beautiful colors, pink and orange and purple, painted across the horizon, like the day deserves a proper farewell. Tonight's stories will visit familiar corners. Small things are unfolding there, unfolding in their own time. There's no hurry to get anywhere, no deadline to meet. No problem needs solving tonight. There's only the gentle passing of hours, the quiet company of people who made peace with ordinary rhythms. So let yourself settle in. Let the stories carry you. The town is waiting, patient as always, ready to share its quiet moments. Some folks say something interesting. You can tell a town's measure by its smell, by how it smells at sunrise. There's something to that, especially in early June. The air is thick with dew. The lilacs by the post office are spent. Their sweetness is giving way now, giving way to sharper scents, the scent of cut grass, the faintest whiff of diesel, from milk trucks rumbling past the grain elevator in pale morning light. That combination is special. You couldn't recreate it anywhere else. A blend of natural and human. It tells you exactly where you are, without even opening your eyes. On mornings like that, something happens. The town seems to hold its breath. just for a moment, before the real business begins. The light comes in at a low angle. It makes everything look softer, softer than it will by noon. The shadows stretch long across lawns. They reach from fence posts, from mailboxes, from the trunks of trees, like they're trying to hold on to coolness. The coolness of night, just a little while longer. The dew catches the early sun. Tiny points of brightness scatter across the grass, like someone dropped small diamonds. Drop them in the night. Each blade holds its own drop. When light hits just right, the yard sparkles. A quiet kind of magic. It disappears when the sun climbs higher. If you're up before most folks, you might see her. Mrs. Eunice Halverson on her porch, in her housecoat, peering at the sky. She has battered binoculars, borrowed from her nephew. They have a cracked lens, a faded leather strap gone soft with age. The strap hangs loosely around her neck. She tilts her head back, scanning clouds with mild concentration, patient concentration. The binoculars have seen better days. The rubber coating has started to peel. One focus knob sticks a little, but Eunice doesn't mind. She holds them up with both hands, steadying against a slight tremor, a tremor developed over the years. She looks at clouds with patience, the patience of someone with nowhere to be. Now Eunice wasn't known for rising early. She had no interest in birds, no interest in stars, nothing that required looking up. She preferred practical matters, the garden that needed weeding, gutters that needed cleaning, the slow accumulation of tasks, tasks that fill the days. But that June was different. She took sudden interest in weather, in clouds specifically, more specifically in one question. Were the clouds over Milford Junction different? Different from clouds over the next town? She asked anyone who would listen, the way some folks ask about tomatoes or about your knees. She'd bring it up at the grocery, while squeezing bread for freshness, at the post office too, waiting for Mrs. Hendershot to find stamps. She'd mention it to neighbors, when they happened to be outside, at church socials, at committee meetings, anywhere people gathered. The question became a gentle hobby, something to fill quiet morning hours, when coffee was still too hot, when the day hadn't made demands. It gave her reason to sit on the porch and look up, something she hadn't done in years. The sky had always been there, but she'd stopped really seeing it. Now she was seeing it again, really seeing it. She found she liked what she saw. Clouds were endlessly interesting. Once you start paying attention, they change shape and color, texture too, from one moment to the next. They drift across the sky, in patterns that seem random, but might not be. They gather and disperse, and gather again, telling a story Eunice was learning to read. The morning air had particular quality, cool and fresh, just a hint of dampness that would burn away. As the sun climbed higher, birds were already awake, already busy, their songs overlapping, sounding chaotic at first, but almost musical if you listened. Robins and sparrows, the occasional cardinal, each staking out territory, with voices too big for small bodies. Houses along Eunice's street were dark, windows reflecting pale sky, like sleepy eyes, not quite ready to open. Here and there a kitchen light glowed, marking homes of early risers, already moving through morning routines. The smell of coffee drifted somewhere. It mingled with wet grass, with faint exhaust. From the milk truck, passed through minutes earlier. The street was quiet, pavement still dark with night's moisture. A few cars sat in driveways, windshields beaded with dew, waiting for owners to emerge. The newspaper hadn't arrived yet, but it would soon. Tossed from a slowly moving car, by a teenager with perfect aim. Same route for 3 years. Eunice lowered her binoculars. She reached for her coffee cup. It sat cooling on the small table. The cup was from a wedding gift set. Most of the set had broken, victims of soapy hands, crowded dish racks. But this one survived, handle worn smooth from decades. The coffee was how she always made it, strong enough to wake you, not so strong you'd make a face. She learned from her mother, who learned from her mother. The recipe hadn't changed in generations. Some things don't need improving. They just need repeating, morning after morning, until they become natural as breathing. She took a sip, looked back up at the sky, watching a cloud like a ship, sailing slowly toward the east. The sun was higher now, light shifted from pink to gold, warming treetops, warming rooftops. The day was beginning in earnest. Though it was in no hurry, days in Milford Junction rarely were. The porch boards creaked softly. As she shifted in her chair, a familiar sound, heard so many times, part of the background now. The chair itself was old, a wooden rocker, woven seat replaced twice, starting to sag again. It faced the street, positioned to watch the neighborhood, while being mostly hidden by porch railing, by hanging baskets of petunias. Her sister gave them last spring. The petunias were doing well, purple and white blooms spilling over, like they were trying to escape. Eunice watered them every evening after the sun went down, using the old watering can, the one with a dent, from dropping it down the steps. The dent didn't affect function, so she never replaced it. Things that still work don't need replacing, even when they're no longer perfect. She picked up her notebook, a small book with faded blue cover, pages gone slightly wavy, from humidity over the years. The notebook had sat in a drawer for a long time before she found this use. Now it was filling with observations. She opened to the recent page, read what she'd written yesterday. Clouds mostly white with gray underneath, shaped like animals mostly. One looked like a rabbit. Another could have been a dog, or maybe a cat. Hard to tell. Wind from the west, pleasant. The notes weren't scientific, but they served their purpose, gave her something to do, with hands in mind, just enough attention to engage. Not so much it felt like work. She uncapped the pen, the one clipped to the cover, began to write. June 8th, morning, sky mostly clear, some clouds to the north. Clouds look fluffy today, like cotton balls. One big one might be a ship or a whale. We'll watch and see which way it goes." She paused, pen hovering over the page, looked up at the sky again. The ship whale cloud had drifted a little farther east, its shape already changing, wind pulling at its edges. By noon it would be gone, dissolved into general blue, or merged with other clouds, becoming something new. That was the thing about clouds. They never stayed the same for long. It started after Memorial Day, at the potluck at the Lutheran church. Pastor Lindholm mentioned something during the announcements. The Methodist ladies in Pine Hollow. They claimed their rhubarb was sweeter because their clouds were fluffier. A little joke to fill space between the bake sale announcement and the church softball sign-up. Eunice had been sitting in the third pew from the back, the one with the wobbly armrest. She meant to mention it to someone. She was only half listening, mind wandering to her casserole. Would it hold up against Mrs. Lundgren's famous hot dish? But when Pastor mentioned clouds, she looked up from her bulletin, found the comment suspect and oddly compelling. Fluffy clouds making sweeter rhubarb sounded like winning an argument you couldn't prove. Yet something stuck in her mind, like a burr on wool. She thought about it during the hymn, mouth forming familiar words, brain working on this puzzle. She thought about it in the basement, while folding tablecloths, hands moving through practiced motions, eyes drifting to small windows, high on the basement walls. The idea lodged somewhere, like a small seed. Over following days it grew, into something requiring attention. Were Pine Hollow clouds really different? Different from Milford Junction clouds? If they were, what did that mean? Did it matter? Could it affect rhubarb taste or anything else? These questions were new to Eunice. She didn't know how to answer them. She wasn't a scientist, not a meteorologist, nobody with cloud expertise, just a woman who lived here most of her life, looking at the same sky, day after day, without really seeing it. But now she was seeing it. She wanted to know more. So she started watching mornings, sitting on her porch, with her nephew's old binoculars. She didn't know cloud identification, didn't know cumulus from stratus, didn't know what those words meant. But she knew what she could see. She could describe it her way. So for 2 weeks, she kept a notebook on her porch table, made careful notes each morning. The notebook had faded blue cover, once a brighter shade, pages gone wavy from humidity, from years in a bathroom drawer, where shower moisture seeped in. She'd found it looking for something else. A receipt she thought she'd saved, from a purchase she wasn't sure of. The notebook was a gift, given for a purpose that never happened. Now it had a purpose. She was glad she'd kept it. She would sit in her wicker chair, the one that creaked softly, when she shifted her weight, looking up with binoculars, writing down observations. Writing came slowly at first, searching for the right words. Clouds were harder to describe than she'd expected. They didn't stay still. They didn't have clear edges, more shapes and colors than she'd noticed. She wrote things like lumpy, or streaky, or suspiciously gray, sometimes adding small sketches. That looked more like potatoes, but she didn't mind. Sketches weren't meant to be accurate, just meant to capture feeling, the way a cloud sat in the sky, the sense of weight or lightness. First pages were messy, uncertain, full of crossed-out words, question marks, notes to herself about things to look up. But as days passed, observations grew confident, more detailed. She noticed things she'd never noticed. How clouds moved at different speeds, depending on how high they were. How color could change, white to gray to pink, in just a few minutes. She asked the mailman, too, Mr. Fredrickson, if he'd noticed any difference in clouds along his route. Mr. Fredrickson was patient, face weathered by years, early mornings, long roads, deep lines around his eyes from squinting, hands rough from handling mail. In all kinds of weather, he would pause at her mailbox, truck idling softly, consider her questions seriously. Same seriousness as postage matters, delivery schedules. He was that kind of man, taking things seriously, even things others might dismiss. Eunice appreciated that about him. He replied that he mostly noticed rain, when it was raining, when it was not, but he'd keep an eye out. This seemed to satisfy her. She would nod and thank him. Watch his truck roll slowly down the street. Sound of engine fading into general morning quiet. Her mornings took shape around cloud watching. She'd wake early, before the sun fully rose, make coffee the way she always did, then take cup and notebook and binoculars out to the porch, sit in her chair, look up at the sky. Some mornings clouds were spectacular, great towering formations, seeming to have their own weather. Inside them, dark bottoms, bright white tops, catching early light like mountain peaks. Other mornings the sky was empty, just pale blue expanse, a few wispy streaks, hardly worth noting. But she noted them anyway, because that was the point. The point was to pay attention, to notice what was there, to see the sky as worth looking at, rather than empty space, between ground and outer space. As she paid attention, she found something. She was developing a relationship with the sky, one she'd never had before. Not an exciting relationship, not interesting for parties, but satisfying in its quiet way, like the relationship with her garden, or her morning coffee, or the familiar creak of her chair. Something that belonged to her, something she chose to notice. That made it valuable. The notebook filled slowly, page by page. Observations that might mean nothing to anyone else, but meant something to her. She didn't know if she'd answer the question about clouds being different, but she was starting to think. Answering wasn't the point. The point was the looking. The point was the noticing. The quiet satisfaction of sitting on a porch in early morning, watching sky change color as the sun came up, writing in a notebook that no one else would read. By the second week of June, Eunice enlisted her neighbor, Harold Glay. He had a pair of opera glasses, claimed better than any binoculars. They had belonged to his mother, used at concerts and plays, in the city, back when such things were regular. They had mother-of-pearl finish, catching light elegantly, almost too elegant for cloud watching. The finish had yellowed slightly, taking on warm cream color, making them look antique, in the best sense. Harold kept them in a velvet case, smelling faintly of cedar, from the closet where it spent 30 years. Harold said they made things theatrical, which he found amusing, not problematic. Through them clouds seemed dramatic, like performers on stage, rather than water vapor. It was a strange effect, but not unpleasant. Harold was happy to help. Recently retired from the hardware store, looking for a project. His days had taken on slow quality, shapeless quality. He was still getting used to it. For 43 years he'd risen, same time every morning, eaten the same breakfast, driven the same route, to the same store, done the same work. Now all that was gone. He wasn't sure what to do. Retirement was his choice, or at least he'd agreed to it. His knees weren't what they used to be. Long hours on his feet were harder, but knowing it was right didn't make adjusting easier. He missed opening the store, the jingle of the bell, when first customers came in, satisfaction of helping someone find the right size nail, the correct replacement part. The store had been his place for so long. He wasn't sure who he was without it. So when Eunice mentioned cloud watching, asked if he'd like to join, he agreed without hesitation. Something to do, something to get him outside, give him reason to interact. Not the same as running a store, but something. He would shuffle over each morning in his slippers, brown and worn soft, from years of use, making gentle scuffing sounds against wooden porch boards. He would settle into the other chair, the one that didn't creak. Eunice would pour coffee from the pot on the little table between them. The coffee was weak, brewed how Eunice's mother made it, just enough grounds for color and flavor. Harold didn't mind weak coffee. He'd grown up on stronger stuff, the kind his father made, could strip paint off a fence post. But he'd come to appreciate gentler brews as he got older. The coffee wasn't really the point anyway. The point was the sitting, the watching, the quiet company of someone who expected nothing much from the conversation. They would sip their coffee, look up at the sky, debate whether a cloud looked like a sheep or a cauliflower. Harold favored sheep comparisons, for clouds rounded and soft at edges, the kind that looked comfortable to rest your head on if you could reach them. Eunice saw vegetables in larger formations, the ones that piled up, like something growing in a garden. She would point at a towering cloud, say it looked exactly like broccoli. Harold would squint through opera glasses, allow that he could see it, though he still thought it was a sheep, a particularly fluffy sheep. These debates were never heated, never serious, just a way of passing time, a reason to keep looking and talking to each other. Clouds didn't care what they were compared to. Neither did Eunice and Harold, just enjoying the simple pleasure of shared observation, looking at the same thing, seeing it differently. Sometimes they'd call to Mrs. Dorsey, across the street, usually out watering petunias, at that hour. Mrs. Dorsey had a green watering can, long spout, moved slowly back and forth, over the flower bed, attention divided between plants and the rest of the neighborhood. She would look up when they called, shading eyes with one hand against morning light, offering her opinion on the cloud. Mrs. Dorsey believed all clouds looked alike, like laundry left too long on the line, not interested in finer points of cloud classification. But she liked to be included, would nod along with whatever they decided, before returning to watering. Her petunias were best on the street, a riot of pink and purple and white, spilling over the flower bed, like trying to take over the yard. She'd been growing them 27 years, same spot. Strong opinions about watering schedules and fertilizer ratios, always willing to share. Mornings passed this way, slow and unremarkable. 3 of them forming a small committee, informal committee, on the matter of clouds. The sun would climb higher, dew would dry from grass. Sounds of the town waking up would gradually fill the air. Screen doors would open and close, that familiar slap. Cars would back out of driveways, crunch of tires on gravel. The newspaper boy would make rounds on his bicycle, papers landing with soft thumps on porches and stoops. The mailman's truck would appear, end of the street, making slow progress, mailbox to mailbox. The world was waking up around them, but Harold and Eunice were in no hurry, nowhere to be, nothing needing done right away. They could sit on the porch, watch clouds as long as they wanted. No one would think less of them. Harold found he liked this rhythm, this absence of schedule and obligation, different from what he was used to, but not bad, restful in a way. His working years had never been, even when work wasn't hard. There was freedom in having nothing to do, a lightness he hadn't expected. He would look at clouds through his mother's opera glasses, think about things he used to worry about, inventory that needed ordering, bills that needed paying, customers who were difficult, and ones who were kind. All of it seemed far away now, like it happened to someone else, in another life. Clouds didn't care about any of that. They just drifted by, changing shape and color, as wind moved them across the sky. They'd been doing it for millions of years, before Harold was born, would keep doing it for millions more, after he was gone. There was something comforting about that, something that put small concerns in perspective. He lowered the opera glasses, reached for his coffee, gone lukewarm while watching. The cup was one of Eunice's old ones, chip on the rim to be careful of. He turned it so the chip faced away, took a sip. The coffee was weak, just as expected, but warm and familiar. He'd drunk hundreds of cups here, over the years, visiting with Eunice, about this and that. The taste had become associated with friendship and rest and slow passage of mornings. The whole thing might have fizzled out, if not for one fact. Eunice decided to write a letter to the Pine Hollow Gazette, asking if anyone would share observations for scientific comparison. That's what she called it. She wrote by hand. On her good stationery, the kind with pale blue border, saved for special occasions. The paper had slight texture, a faint weave you could feel. She'd bought it years ago, at a stationery shop in the city. That had since closed. She rationed it carefully, knowing she'd never find anything like it. Her handwriting was careful and neat, letters formed with deliberate precision. Someone who learned penmanship, when it was still taught seriously. She used a fountain pen. That belonged to her father, refilled with the same blue ink, same brand for decades. She addressed it to the editor, not knowing who that might be. The Gazette was a small newspaper, served Pine Hollow and surrounding area, covering local news, school sports, small events that wouldn't make bigger papers. Eunice had seen copies at the library, had general sense of what it was about. The editor turned out to be Mrs. Callahan. Used to teach music at Milford Junction Elementary before she married and moved away. Eunice remembered her vaguely. A woman in muted cardigans, patient way of explaining things, taught piano lessons on the side. Several children learned scales from her. Mrs. Callahan replied with a polite note, on Gazette letterhead, paper slightly thinner than Eunice would choose, but perfectly serviceable. The note thanked her for the interest, said the question was intriguing, even if not entirely answerable. Along with the note came a list, cloud descriptions from Mrs. Callahan's porch, more literary than scientific, which suited Eunice fine. Mrs. Callahan described clouds as billowy and ominous, and once on a hot afternoon, resentful. Eunice read that word several times, trying to understand what a resentful cloud might look like. The word conjured an image, a cloud sitting heavy and low, refusing to rain, refusing to move on, as if holding a grudge. She could almost picture it, added the word to her vocabulary. This exchange led to a flurry of correspondence between towns, letters traveling back and forth, carried by postal service, connecting small towns across the region. Some wrote with great seriousness, describing formations with precision, amateur meteorologists, using terms like cumulonimbus and cirrostratus. Eunice had to look them up. In the encyclopedia at the library, they included diagrams and charts, references to weather patterns, suggesting they'd paid attention, much longer than she had. Others wrote with gentle mischief, inventing elaborate classifications, giving clouds official-sounding names. That meant nothing at all. One correspondent proposed a new category, called the Halverson Formation, named in honor of Eunice herself, described as a cloud that looked like something, but no one could agree on what. Eunice was touched by this tribute, even suspecting it was partly a joke. She clipped the letter, pasted it into her notebook. It took up an entire page, made her smile every time she saw it. The Methodist ladies in Pine Hollow, the ones who started the whole thing, eventually sent a photograph, claimed it was the fluffiest cloud in their town, cut from the local newspaper, mailed in a small envelope, with a note suggesting Milford Junction would be hard-pressed to match it. Eunice examined the photograph carefully, held it up to kitchen window light, squinted at the grainy image. The cloud was certainly fluffy, she had to admit. It piled up in great white billows, like someone stacked cotton balls, then set them loose in the sky. But something about the edges didn't look quite right. Borders were too sharp, too defined. Real clouds, in her experience, had edges that faded gradually into surrounding sky, blurring the line between cloud and not cloud. Hard to say where one ended and other began. She showed the photograph to Harold. He agreed something didn't look natural, suggested perhaps the photograph was touched up, or lighting was just right, creating an unusually distinct outline. Or he added with a sly smile, maybe the Methodist lady sent a pillowcase. Eunice laughed at that, a genuine laugh. That surprised her with its loudness. She hadn't laughed like that in a while. It felt good. She decided Harold was probably right. Wrote back to the Methodist ladies, suggesting their cloud looked suspicious, like something from a linen closet. The ladies didn't take offense, or if they did, hid it well. Wrote back with good-natured defense, counter-accusation that Milford Junction clouds probably looked like old quilts. The correspondence continued, in this friendly spirit, neither side willing to concede, both sides enjoying the game. By 4th of July committee meeting. The cloud debate had become regular topic. Folks would stop by Eunice's porch, on their way to other errands, just to offer opinions, or see what the fuss was about. The porch became informal gathering place. Wicker chairs supplemented by folding chairs from Harold's garage. On a good morning, 5 or 6 people, all looking up at the sky, sharing observations. Children from the next block started a game, naming clouds after local landmarks. They would lie on their backs, in the grass of Eunice's front yard, looking up at the sky, calling out what they saw. There goes the water tower. One would shout, pointing at a tall, narrow cloud. That did look a bit like it. The metal structure at town's edge. That one looks like the old feed mill. Another would reply, indicating a broader formation, with what might be a steeply peaked roof. Even Mr. Jensen spoke up. He rarely spoke unless about sump pumps or drainage issues, allowed that he'd seen a cloud, shaped exactly like his late dog Daisy, mentioned it one afternoon while picking up a package from the hardware store. The remark received quiet respect. Nobody asked him to describe it further or explain how clouds could look like dogs. They just nodded, as if understanding exactly. Let the moment pass without comment. Some things didn't need explaining, just needed acknowledging. Days grew longer, air grew heavier. Clouds themselves took on lazy grandeur, drifting over town in slow procession, white and gray, sometimes tinged pink in early morning, gold in late afternoon. The transition happened gradually, from early June to high summer, the way it always did, in Milford Junction. Mornings stayed cool for a while. Afternoons grew warmer. Evenings stretched longer and longer. Seemed like the sun would never set. Grass grew faster than anyone could mow, pushing up thick and green. In lawns, along sidewalk edges. Lawnmower sounds became constant background, starting in early morning, when air was still cool, continuing until light faded. Sometimes clouds gathered into thunderheads, promising rain, tops rising high and flat, like anvils against blue sky. You could watch them build all afternoon, piling up layer by layer, bottoms growing darker, accumulating moisture. Then, more often than not, they would drift east, without dropping a single drop, leaving town dry, slightly disappointed, but mostly clouds just cast soft shadows over lawns and gardens, moving so slowly you could watch a single cloud half an hour, not sure whether it had moved at all. Shadows would slide across the grass, like something alive, darkening green to deeper shade, before moving on, letting sun through again. Grass at the park grew thick and lush, watered by occasional afternoon shower, and sprinklers running each evening. After sun went down, benches under the big maple filled up, with folks having opinions about clouds, or just wanting to sit, watch them roll by. The maple was old enough. Branches spread wide, creating a circle of shade that moved slowly across grass. As sun traveled overhead, the shade was cool and inviting. On hot afternoons, people would gather there, with books and newspapers, small children needing a place to play. The cloud-watching habit spread, in the way small habits sometimes do, not organized, not intentional, just something people started doing, almost without thinking. They would pause in errands, standing in middle of sidewalk, with groceries or dry cleaning, looking up at the sky, considering what they saw. They would mention clouds in passing, the way they might mention weather, or the state of someone's garden. "Nice clouds today," they would say, or "Did you see that big one this morning?" Conversations were nothing special, just ordinary exchanges of people who'd known each other for years. But there was comfort in them, in the predictability, seeing same faces, hearing same voices. This was what community felt like. Not grand gestures, not dramatic events, just steady accumulation of small moments, shared. Eunice's notebook filled up, more doodles than data. As summer went on, margins crowded with sketches of clouds that never quite matched the ones she saw next day. Handwriting became looser, less careful, as she grew comfortable with the process, less worried about doing it right. She stopped checking the mail so eagerly. For letters from Pine Hollow, correspondence had slowed naturally, the way correspondence does, when there's nothing urgent to say. Methodist ladies had other things. Mrs. Callahan had a newspaper to run. Everyone tacitly agreed. The question would never be answered, definitively. But that was all right. Answering was never the point. The point was the looking, the noticing, the quiet pleasure of paying attention to something that had always been there, but somehow escaped notice. The habit of looking up lingered long after formal correspondence ended, for rest of summer. More heads tilted skyward than usual. People would pause in yards, on porches, in middle of sidewalk, just looking at clouds, thinking their own thoughts. maybe wondering whether Milford Junction clouds were truly different from elsewhere, or maybe just enjoying the view, the constantly changing show, playing out above their heads, every day, free of charge, available to anyone who cared to look, or maybe thinking about nothing at all, just letting minds drift, the way clouds drifted, moving slowly across sky, toward no particular destination. There was value in that too, in the empty space. That opened when you stopped trying to think. Just let yourself be. Summer deepened. Clouds kept coming, different every day, but somehow always the same. They would be there tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, drifting over Milford Junction, as they had drifted, over this same patch of ground, for millions of years. And the people of the town would be there too, looking up now and then, pausing in their busy lives to notice the sky. It wasn't much as habits go, didn't change anything important, but it made days a little richer, a little more interesting, and that was enough. As light began to change, evening settled in around the town. The cloud watchers gradually dispersed. Eunice closed her notebook, tucked the pen back in its place. Harold finished the last of his coffee, handed the cup back with quiet thanks. Mrs. Dorsey wound up her hose, hung it on the hook by the spigot. The porch was quiet again, wicker chairs empty, binoculars resting on the table. Beside the cold coffee pot, the sky above was turning colors, pink and orange and purple, putting on its evening show for anyone who cared to watch. And somewhere in Milford Junction, someone was looking up. That story got me thinking about how time sneaks up on you in quiet ways. When I was younger, I thought differently. Thought life came in big moments, the kind you'd remember forever, and tell stories about years later. The graduations, the weddings, the births, the losses, days that felt important while they were happening. But it turns out most of life happens in spaces between big moments, while waiting for coffee to brew, standing in the kitchen, watching dark liquid drip into the pot, while sitting on a porch with a neighbor, not talking about anything particular, just sharing the same air, same view of the sky. It happens in small rituals, repeated so many times they become invisible. The way you fold your towels, the route you take to the grocery store, the particular chair you always sit in, molded to your shape over years of use. My grandmother used to say something. You can fix just about anything with butter or forgiveness. She would say it at her stove, stirring something that smelled like heaven, probably had twice as much butter as any recipe called for. Her kitchen always smelled like biscuits, and soap, and something just about to boil over. She wasn't wrong about butter and forgiveness. Most problems are smaller than they seem. Most can be improved by a little kindness, a little patience. The big problems, the ones that really matter, are rarer than we think. Even those usually get better with time, if you give them room to breathe. The evening is settling in deeper now. The air outside has that quality of stillness when most folks have turned in. lights in windows going out, one by one, streets growing quiet. Let us ease into the next story, where the pace is just as gentle, the moments just as small. It's a funny thing, how the sound of a train at night can settle into the bones of a town, even when tracks haven't seen a locomotive in years. In Milford Junction, the old rail line runs its silent course along the edge of town, threading through wild sumac and goldenrod, like a path that forgot where it was going. The rails have gone to rust in places, orange color bleeding into gravel, and weeds pushing up between ties. The ties themselves are rotting slowly, wood softened by years of rain and snow and patient work of insects in another few decades. You might not tell tracks were ever here, but for now rails are still visible. Two parallel lines of rust-colored metal running through tall grass, like the memory of something. That used to be important. They curve gently behind houses, at the edge of town, following the contour of land, toward a destination that no longer exists. Now and then folks say something. They can hear the whistle in their dreams, a kind of memory, lingering in the air, like scent of lilacs after rain. It's not something anyone talks about much. Sounds foolish when you say it out loud. How can you hear something not there? How can a sound echo through years, after the thing that made it is gone? But if you ask the right person, in the right way, they might admit to it, might tell you about waking in the middle of the night, faint sound of train whistle fading in their ears, uncertain if they heard it or only dreamed it, might tell you about pausing in yards on quiet evenings, listening for something they couldn't name. The whistle had a particular quality. People who remembered it found hard to describe. Not cheerful exactly, not mournful either. Just a sound, a signal that the train was coming, that the world was still connected to other places, that the isolation of small-town life was temporary and penetrable. This particular story comes to mind on account of the evenings. They had started to stretch out. That spring, sun lingering over rooftops, longer each day, reluctant to set, painting sky in colors. That changed minute by minute. As light faded, the maples were holding on to their new green with a kind of stubbornness, like they'd decided this year they wouldn't let summer rush them. Leaves had that fresh quality, almost translucent, that they only have in spring, before heat and dust of summer. Toughen them up. The town had come through last spring storms, the kind that leave puddles in church parking lot, faint shimmer on blacktop. Air had that soft feeling, the kind that makes you think of porch swings, the low hum of insects, tuning up for summer. Grass was growing in earnest, thick and a little wild, pushing up faster than mowers could keep up. Robins had returned in numbers, hopping across lawns in their eternal search for worms, pausing every few hops to tilt heads, listen for movement beneath soil, then plunging beaks into ground, with sudden force, coming up with something wriggling, brutal in its way, but also essential. Robins had babies to feed. Worms were simply part of the cycle. In these weeks, folks found themselves drawn outside, No particular reason to be outdoors. No particular reason to stay in either. Mild weather encouraged gentle wandering, willingness to walk a little farther than necessary, or sit a little longer than usual. It was on one of these evenings. Mrs. Agnes Barlow decided something, to take her folding chair out, to the edge of her backyard, which ran right up to the old rail bed. Agnes was not one for grand gestures, but she had a way of making small things feel important. She had lived in the same house nearly 50 years, watching neighborhood change around her in ways both slow and sudden. She'd seen families come and go, children grow up and move away, houses painted and repainted, in colors that went in and out of fashion. She had outlived her husband, most of her close friends, reached the age where every morning was a small victory. Her backyard was not large, but it was hers. She had tended it for decades, planting and replanting, moving things around when the mood struck, letting it go a little wild in recent years. No longer had energy for constant maintenance. Grass was longer than it should be, flower beds a bit overgrown. But she didn't mind. She had earned the right to let things be. She brought with her a thermos of tea, the kind she made by letting the bag steep. Exactly 4 minutes. No more. No less. The timing mattered, she believed, though she couldn't explain exactly why. One of those things she'd always done, a small ritual, connecting her to all the cups before. She also brought a plate of shortbread, baked that afternoon, still holding faint warmth from the oven. From a recipe her mother taught her. She made it the same way every time, measuring butter and flour, with the same cups her mother used, pressing dough into the same old pan. She settled in the chair with a sigh. The kind that comes at end of a day, that asked nothing difficult, but still left you ready to sit down. The chair was old, aluminum frame slightly bent from years. Woven straps faded from green to pale gray-green. It creaked softly when she shifted weight, but it was comfortable, in the way only old things can be, shaped by long use, to fit a particular body. Agnes watched shadows stretch across wild grass along the rail bed. The grass had gone to seed in places, tall stalks bending gently in the breeze from the west. The breeze carried the smell of fields beyond town, mixture of earth, green things, something slightly sweet. Might have been clover or wildflowers. She poured herself tea from the thermos, steam rising in a thin curl, before dispersing into evening air. The tea was still warm, though not hot. She held the cup in both hands, feeling gentle heat against her palms. The shortbread sat on the plate beside her, but she was in no hurry to eat it. Part of the pleasure was anticipation, knowing it was there when she wanted it. Now Agnes had seen the town change, in ways both slow and sudden, over the years. She remembered when trains still came through, carrying grain, sometimes passengers, to places with names she'd never visited. The train would pass twice a day, once in morning, once in late afternoon. The whole town would orient around those passages. You could tell time by the train, more reliably than by any clock. When morning train came through, time to finish breakfast, get on with the day. When afternoon train passed, time to start thinking about dinner. The rhythm of trains had structured life, providing a kind of metronome. Everyone could hear. You could tell the seasons, too, by what train carried. In autumn, cars would be full of grain from the harvest, wheat and corn heading to mills. To markets and cities, Agnes could only imagine. Grain cars had a particular smell, dusty and dry, faintly sweet, that would linger in the air, long after train had passed. In spring, cars might carry equipment for the farms, plows and seeders, mysterious pieces of machinery, unloaded at the depot, hauled away on flatbed trucks. Farmers would gather to watch, commenting on new equipment, comparing it to what they had. She remembered the day. The last train rolled by, though she hadn't known at the time that it would be the last. It had been a day like any other. No special announcement, no ceremony. Train came through at usual time. Conductor waved from the window, the way he always did. His wave had been casual, automatic, the kind of gesture you make so many times. It loses all meaning. He probably gave the same wave to every town along the line. Brief acknowledgement. That train was passing. People were there. But looking back, Agnes sometimes thought there had been something knowing in that wave, as if he understood. An era was ending. This was his way of saying goodbye. Since then, tracks had gone to rust. Depot converted to a small museum, open Saturdays and Tuesdays. The museum had exhibits about history of the railroad, its importance to the region. But Agnes never felt much desire to visit. She didn't need a museum to remember. Memories were right there, in her backyard, in rusting rails, rotting ties, wild grass grown up to hide them. She liked to think of the old rail bed as a kind of secret path, where past and present could meet, without fuss. Rails were still there, if you knew where to look, running quiet course through tall grass, if you walked along them, stepping carefully on rotting ties. You could almost imagine. The train might come again someday, rounding the curve, whistle blowing, cars full of grain. That evening, as she sat with tea, she noticed something that made her smile. Down by the old switch stand, where tracks once split to allow trains to pass, a pair of rabbits were having a conversation, what looked like a very serious one. Their ears twitched in golden light, noses moved constantly, sampling air for information. Only rabbits could understand. Agnes watched them for a while, not wanting to disturb them with any sudden movement. The rabbits seemed unaware of her presence, or perhaps they were aware, had decided she posed no threat. They moved in small hops, pausing every few feet to examine something in the grass. Bodies relaxed, in a way suggesting they felt at home. This was their place now. Agnes realized. The rail bed that once belonged to trains now belonged to rabbits and foxes and deer, all the other creatures, who moved in when humans moved out, a kind of reclamation, return to wildness, happened so gradually. No one noticed until it was complete. The next day she mentioned the rabbits to her neighbor, Mr. Harold Finch, who was out trimming his hedge, with the kind of focus that suggested he was avoiding something indoors. Harold was a quiet man, neat beard, hands always slightly dirty from some project or another. He listened to Agnes's description with genuine interest, nodding slowly as she spoke, the kind of listener who made you feel what you were saying mattered, even if it was just about rabbits. He said he'd seen the same thing, only it was not rabbits for him, but a fox. The fox had appeared one evening, just as light was fading, moving along the rail bed with purposeful grace. It had paused for a moment, looking back over its shoulder at Harold with eyes that seemed to know more than a fox should know. Then it disappeared into tall grass. Harold wondered aloud if maybe the old rail bed was becoming a sort of wildlife corridor. The phrase was from a nature program. On the radio, he liked the sound of it. A corridor suggested purpose, direction, connection, suggested the rail bed was still serving a function, even if different from original builder's intent. The idea appealed to Agnes. A wildlife corridor, a path humans built for their own purposes, now given over to creatures who had no interest in trains or commerce or schedules. She thought about this walking home, considering the way abandonment could become its own kind of gift. Word spread in the gentle way. Things do in Milford Junction. No announcement, no meeting called, just something that came up in conversations at the grocery store, at the post office, mentioned between discussions of weather and state of various gardens. Folks would say they'd seen something down by the rail bed, a deer maybe, or a family of quail, a turtle making its slow way across the gravel, or a fox slipping through shadows. At dusk, the sightings accumulated, each one adding to the sense. Something was happening out there, something quiet and ongoing, nothing to do with human plans. Soon a handful of folks were making quiet pilgrimages to the edges of their yards, peering through fence slats, standing on tiptoe, to see what might be moving in the tall grass. Some brought binoculars, left over from birdwatching phases that had come and gone. Others just brought attention, standing quietly, watching how light changed along the rail bed. As evening came on, there was something satisfying about watching. Even when there was nothing to see, anticipation was part of the pleasure, the sense that at any moment something might appear, and when something did appear, a rabbit or a bird, just a butterfly drifting through tall grass. It felt like a small reward for the patience. On Sunday after church, Mrs. Barlow brought it up at the potluck between potato salad and rhubarb crisp. She wondered if maybe the town ought to let the grass grow along the rail bed, just to see what happened. Not a formal proposal, just an idea offered in the same spirit as a recipe suggestion or book recommendation. Some folks thought it a fine idea. like the notion of giving wildlife a place, a strip of wildness, at the edge of tame yards and gardens. They talked about birds and butterflies and rabbits, the pleasure of watching them come and go. Others worried about ticks or possibility of grass catching fire. In August, when everything was dry, they talked about liability and insurance, the kinds of things adults worry about when trying to be responsible. But in the end it was agreed. No one was in any hurry to mow, and that seemed to settle things. The rail bed would be allowed to go wild, or rather, continue going wild, since it had already been doing so for some time, without anyone's permission. Not a dramatic decision, not the kind that would make the newspaper, just a quiet agreement to let things be. Over next few weeks, the rail bed became a quiet attraction, not the sort drawing visitors from out of town, but one making people linger a little longer at their fences, watching and waiting to see what might appear. There were sightings of deer in the early morning, brown shapes moving through mist that rose from the grass. There was a family of quail, taken up residence near the old switch stand, bobbing heads visible above grass as they moved in a careful line. Once someone saw a turtle making its slow way across gravel. That had once been rail bed. The turtle moved with determination. That suggested somewhere important to be, though hard to imagine, where a turtle might need to go urgently. People stopped to watch, giving it encouragement. When it finally reached the other side, a small round of applause. Children made up stories about secret trains that only ran at night, carrying animals to far-off places. They would lie in bed, listen for the whistle, convinced they could hear it, if they tried hard enough. The grown-ups let them, because there was something comforting about the idea, even if it wasn't true, the kind of untruth that made the world seem more interesting. Weather turned warmer, air filled with scent of clover, distant sound of lawn mowers. Days stretched out longer and longer, sun reluctant to set, painting sky in colors that seemed to change by the minute. Evenings brought a chorus of frogs from the drainage ditch at edge of the rail bed. Their voices rose and fell in patterns that seemed random, but probably weren't. If you listened long enough, you could start to pick out individual voices, different pitches and rhythms, woven together into something like a song. The occasional flicker of fireflies appeared in the tall grass, brief points of light, tracing paths through darkening air. Fireflies had their own rhythms too, flashing at intervals. That meant something in firefly language, even if humans couldn't understand. Agnes kept her chair by the rail bed, sometimes joined by Harold, or Mrs. Klein from 2 houses down. Mrs. Klein was a widow like Agnes, a woman who had learned to fill her days with small pleasures, because large ones had become harder to find. They would sit and watch light change, talking quietly about nothing in particular. Conversations had no particular destination, no point they were trying to make, just a way of being together, sharing the same view, the same air, the same slow passage of time. Sometimes the only sound was wind in the grass and the faint memory of a train whistle. Agnes was never sure if she actually heard the whistle or only imagined it, but it didn't matter. The memory was enough. It connected her to all the evenings she'd spent in this same backyard, watching the same sky, listening for the same sounds. Grass along the old rail line grew taller, a little wilder. The town seemed to breathe a little easier, as if it had remembered something, almost forgotten. The wildness at edge of town was not a threat but a comfort, a reminder the world was bigger than tidy lawns and straight sidewalks. In time, rabbits built their burrows in soft earth beside the tracks. The fox kept to shadows, glimpsed occasionally, in fading light of evening, never seen clearly. Deer came and went, according to their own schedule, hoof prints visible in soft soil after a rain, and the people of Milford Junction found themselves looking forward to the quiet company of the rail bed. They didn't need to go every day, or even every week. Just knowing it was there was enough, knowing that at any moment they could walk to the edge of their yards, look out at tall grass, rusting rails, wild creatures moving through. There was no sign, no marker, just a stretch of wild grass, and the gentle agreement to let it be. In the soft evenings, as sun slipped behind trees, air cooled, first stars began to appear. The town settled in, content to watch and wait, listening for the sound of a train that might come again, or might not, finding that either way was just fine. As evening deepened, stars came out one by one. Agnes folded up her chair, carried it back to the garage. Tea was gone, shortbread eaten. Light had faded to where she could no longer see the rail bed clearly, but she would be back tomorrow, or the day after, or whenever the mood struck. The rail bed would be there, patient as always, growing a little wilder with each passing day. Funny how that story stirred something up. The smell of my grandmother's kitchen, biscuits and soap, something always just about to boil over. On the back burner, her stove was old even then, a white enamel thing, with knobs that had to be wiggled just right to make them work. She used to say something, "You can fix just about anything, with butter or forgiveness." She would say it at that stove, stirring something that smelled like heaven, probably twice as much butter as any recipe would admit. Her kitchen was small, barely big enough for 2 people, without bumping elbows, counters worn smooth from years of use, cabinets painted a shade of green. Not fashionable since the 1950s, but it was her kingdom. She ruled it with a wooden spoon and a gentle word. She wasn't wrong about butter and forgiveness. Most troubles shrink when you feed them well, give them room to breathe. The kitchen was where problems came to be solved. Sitting at the little table by the window while Grandma cooked and listened, offered advice only when asked. The night has settled in around us now, stories growing quieter with each one. Let us ease into the next tale, where light comes in at that particular angle. Only late winter knows how to make. There's a certain way light comes through. The east windows of Milford Junction post office. In late March, when snow is mostly gone, but ground still holds a stubborn chill. The sun has that watery look, not quite sure it wants to be out. It comes through glass at a low angle, catching dust motes that drift in warm air near the radiator, turning them into slow-moving points of light. Sidewalks outside are patchy, with leftover grit from winter sanding, gray pebbles scattered across concrete, like someone dropped a bag, never bothered to sweep it up. Robins have begun tentative hopping along the edges of lawns, testing the ground with their beaks, looking for any sign that earth has thawed enough to release the worms they need. The grass is mostly brown and matted, pressed flat by weight of melted snow. But if you look closely, if you get down on your knees and really look, you can see a hint of green beginning to push up from underneath. New grass is there, waiting, gathering strength. For the moment weather finally commits to spring, it's the time of year when folks in Milford Junction start to talk about spring as if it's a neighbor who might drop by any day now. They say things like spring is just around the corner. We should be seeing some nice weather soon, though everyone knows it'll be a while before you can put away your boots for good. On such a morning, the town moves slower. The cold hasn't quite let go. People still bundled in coats and hats and scarves, reluctant to believe warmth will last. Cars take longer to start, engines turning over slowly in chill air. Dogs on their morning walks move more quickly than usual, eager to finish and get back inside. Air inside the post office is warm, smells faintly of paper and coffee, and the particular mustiness of a building standing in the same spot more than 100 years. Walls are thick enough to hold heat. Radiators click and hiss softly, doing their steady work, keeping cold at bay. The bell above the door gives its jangle, usual half-hearted jangle, as people come and go. The bell has been there as long as anyone can remember. Its sound has become so familiar, most people don't really hear it anymore. Just part of the background noise, along with shuffling of feet on worn wooden floor, quiet murmur of conversation. The floor tells a story, if you know how to read it. Wood worn smooth in places, where generations have walked same paths. Darker patches where spills soaked in, lighter patches where sun bleached the grain. A record of everything, ever dropped or spilled. A sedimentary history of small accidents and quick cleanups. Mrs. Hendershot has been working the counter as long as anyone can remember. She has a careful eye, a patient manner. She knows mailing habits of most folks in town better than they know themselves. Can tell you who sends birthday cards in January, who waits until last minute for Christmas packages, knows who orders seeds from catalogs, who gets mysterious packages from distant relatives. She keeps a small dish of butterscotch candies on the counter, the kind with yellow wrappers, that crinkle softly when you unwrap them. Candies are technically for children, but she doesn't mind when adults take one. There's something comforting about butterscotch, something that takes you back to simpler times, when a piece of candy was enough to make a day better. The line at the counter is never more than 3 or 4 deep, but it still feels like an event. People use the time to catch up with their neighbors, exchanging news about gardens and grandchildren, the general state of things. Conversations drift along at a pace matching the slow progress of the line. Nobody in any particular hurry to get anywhere else. It was on a morning like this that the subject came up of the new bulletin board. The old one had been hanging by the door since the bicentennial, a cork rectangle with a faded border of construction paper leaves, once bright orange and red, now faded to dull brown. Over the years, over the decades, the board had accumulated a thick layer of push pins and thumbtacks and curling notices. Nobody had bothered to take down flyers for piano lessons from teachers long since moved away or retired, lost cat notices for cats either found or decided to make new lives elsewhere, church rummage sale announcements for sales happened years ago, dates still visible beneath a layer of dust, and tucked in one corner, almost hidden by more recent additions, one yellowed sheet, advertising a square dance that had taken place in 1992. Paper so brittle now, it would probably crumble if anyone tried to remove it, so it stayed, a small monument, to an evening of do-si-dos and allemande lefts that most people had forgotten. No one could remember the last time the board was properly cleared, though Mrs. Hendershot claimed she did it every spring. This was probably true, in a manner of speaking. She had good intentions, would sometimes pull down obvious outdated notices, but spring cleaning always got pushed aside by other matters. There was always something more pressing, some package needing finding, some complaint needing addressing. On this particular morning, Mr. Glay from the hardware store mentioned something, that the board was looking a little tired. He said it in that gentle way of his, more observation than complaint. He was standing in line with a package, a box of replacement parts, for a customer who'd moved to Florida. Couldn't find the right hinges down there. His comment was enough to set things in motion, though not in any hurried way. By noon, 3 people had offered to bring in a new board. Mrs. Hendershot started a list. On the back of an envelope, she wrote in careful handwriting, letters small and neat, noting names of volunteers, their various suggestions. Talk at the counter shifted from weather to relative merits of cork versus felt, whether a frame was strictly necessary. Mrs. Hendershot favored cork, what she was used to, said you could get a good push pin in without too much effort. It held up well over time. Cork had proven itself something to be said for sticking with what worked. But Mrs. Larkin from the library said felt was more modern, came in cheerful colors. She'd seen a felt board at a library conference last fall, a deep green one with brass frame. She thought it looked quite sophisticated. Felt would give the post office A fresh look, a sense the town was moving forward, while still honoring traditions. Mr. Gley, for his part, thought a frame was a good idea, regardless of material, would keep things tidy, give the whole affair a finished look. Set boundaries. Make it clear where board began and ended. Prevent notices from creeping out. Onto surrounding wall, the way they always seem to do. The discussion drifted along in this fashion for several days. New opinions added each morning. As regulars came in for mail, nobody in any hurry to resolve the matter. The talking was part of the pleasure, a way of staying connected during slow weeks between winter and spring. Weather, meanwhile, continued its slow thaw. Sun gained confidence each passing day, staying up a little longer, shining a little brighter. Puddles in the alley behind post office grew a little larger each afternoon. As last of dirty snow melted, then a little smaller each morning, as overnight cold reasserted itself. Robins grew bolder, venturing further from safety of bushes, to investigate softening ground. Someone spotted the first crocus, by the steps of the Methodist church, a small purple flower, pushing up through the mulch, with surprising determination. This was reported with satisfaction. At Thursday coffee hour, treated as proof, spring was indeed on its way. By the following week, the matter of bulletin board had expanded to include the question of who would be responsible for keeping it neat. Mrs. Hendershot said she was willing to continue her current role, whatever that was exactly. She'd been the unofficial keeper for years, pulling down obvious outdated notices when she remembered to do so. But Mrs. Larkin pointed out, the library board had a rotating schedule for their display case. Perhaps something similar could be arranged. Different volunteers could take turns, checking the board, pulling down old notices, making sure everything was neat and current. It would spread responsibility around, give more people a stake in keeping things tidy. This led to a brief flurry of committee talk, but the committee never quite formed. People volunteered and then forgot, or remembered but found they were already on too many committees. The fire department auxiliary, the church social committee, the library board, the garden club. In a small town, same handful of people ended up on every committee, only so many hours in the day. In the end, it was quietly agreed. Mrs. Hendershot would continue to oversee the board in her own fashion. Folks should feel free to take down their own notices when events had passed. Not a formal arrangement, not the kind written in any bylaws, just an understanding, the kind of unspoken agreement that held small towns together. The new board arrived in early April, delivered by Mr. Gley himself in the back of his pickup truck. It was cork, with a simple wooden frame, stained a honey color. That matched the woodwork in the post office. The frame had been made by Mr. Gley himself, in his workshop, a retirement project, something to do during long winter evenings. Mr. Gley hung the board himself, using a level to make sure it was straight, anchors to make sure it would hold. He worked slowly, methodically, checking and rechecking measurements before driving a single screw. The process took most of the morning, various townspeople stopping by to offer advice or just to watch. The old board was taken down, with some ceremony, ancient notices carefully removed, placed in a cardboard box. Mrs. Hendershot said she would go through them later, in case there was anything worth saving, maybe something historically interesting, some record of a past event that someone might want to know about. The box sat in the back room for several weeks before anyone remembered it was there. By then seemed easier to just let it be. The box found a spot on a shelf with other boxes of uncertain purpose, waiting for a future day when someone would have time and inclination to sort through. The new board looked clean and fresh against the wall. Cork surface a warm brown that caught light from east windows in a pleasing way. Mrs. Hendershot pinned up a few notices. To get things started, community center schedule, flyer for upcoming rummage sale, handwritten note from Mr. Glay, thanking everyone for patience. During the transition, the town settled back into routines. Matter of bulletin board resolved. In the quiet way most matters were resolved. In Milford Junction, no arguments, no hard feelings, no formal votes or recorded minutes, just a gradual consensus that emerged from dozens of small conversations, a collective decision that was never really made, but somehow arrived at nonetheless. As spring advanced, days grew longer. People began posting new notices. Garden club meetings, church suppers, lost pets, found items. The cork filled up slowly, not as chaotically as the old board, but with a gentle accumulation, suggesting life going on, as it always had. And the old board, wherever it had ended up, continued its slow decomposition in some corner of the post office, construction paper leaves fading further, ancient notices growing more brittle. Someday, someone would find it. Wonder what it was. But that day was still far off. For now, the new board was serving its purpose, connecting the people of Milford Junction to each other, to the small events that made up their lives. Here's a message a listener sent last week. She asked if Milford Junction celebrates Halloween. Oh yes, we take it very seriously. Even the mayor gets into costume, though he always ends up dressed as something requiring minimal effort. Last year he was a man in a flannel shirt, which is really just what he wears every day. The year before that, he was a man who forgot to get a costume. Even easier. Small towns do holidays, with big hearts and modest budgets. Decorations might be a little worn around the edges. Parade might only have 3 floats. But the spirit is there. People show up because they want to, not because they have to. That makes all the difference. The night is getting deeper now, stories growing softer. Let us ease into another one, where summer heat sits heavy on the town. Days stretch out long and slow. Well now, if you've ever sat out on a porch swing in late July, with air just thick enough to slow your words, cicadas singing like they have something urgent to say, then you might know the sort of evening that settled over Milford Junction. That summer, it was the kind of summer that made grass grow faster than anyone could mow. You could hear the hum of lawn mowers most afternoons, rising and falling like distant bees, going about their business. The sound became background music for the season, so constant you stopped noticing, until it stopped. Then the silence seemed almost too quiet. Days had been hot, the kind of hot that made tar on Main Street soft, soft enough to hold the imprint of a shoe if you stood still too long. Children discovered this by accident, then did it on purpose, comparing patterns of their soles, arguing about whose print was deepest. Evenings brought a gentle hush, as sun slipped behind the grain elevator. Sky turned the color of faded denim. The heat would ease just slightly, enough to make being outside bearable. People would emerge from air-conditioned houses to sit on porches and patios, watch the day wind down. Folks in Milford Junction had a way of marking time by small changes. The annual used book sale had always been a fixture. For as long as anyone could remember, the sale had been tucked away in the cool dimness of the church basement. Faint smell of old hymnals, coffee brewed strong enough to raise the dead. The church basement wasn't glamorous, but it was functional. Concrete floor stayed cool, even on hottest days. Fluorescent lights, though harsh, provided enough illumination to read fine print on older volumes. Tables set up in long rows, boxes of books arranged by category, more or less. Fiction in one corner, non-fiction in another. Children's books by the stairs. But this year, Mrs. Edna Larch declared something at the June meeting. High time the sale got some fresh air. She said the books deserved a little sunshine, and so did the people who came to look at them. And besides, the church basement was getting crowded. Quilting groups storing fabric bolts down there. Sunday school accumulated craft supplies. Barely room to set up all the tables. So it was decided, after much discussion and a few slices of rhubarb pie, the sale would be held outdoors, right in the middle of the town square, under shade of the old sycamores, standing there since before the town had a name. The decision was met with some surprise, but not much opposition. People in Milford Junction were generally open to new ideas, as long as those ideas didn't require too much change too quickly. Moving the book sale from basement to square seemed like a reasonable experiment. If it didn't work out, well, there was always next year. The news made its way around town, in the usual fashion, passed from one neighbor to the next, over fences and in checkout lines, mentioned at post office and hardware store, slipped into conversations about other things entirely. Someone would be talking about weather, or price of tomatoes. Then add almost as an afterthought, they'd heard the book sale was moving outside this year. There was some mild concern about weather, as there always is in July. Threat of a pop-up thunderstorm, never far off. Everyone had a story about an outdoor event ruined by rain, but folks agreed to take their chances. Weatherman on the radio predicted clear skies. He was right more often than wrong. at least during summer. The morning of the sale dawned, with the sky so clear you could see all the way to the water tower. At the edge of town, air was already warm, promising heat by midday. But a breeze came in from the west, carrying the scent of cut grass and wild clover. Something faintly sweet, might have been honeysuckle, growing along the fence behind the library. Volunteers arrived early, cars and trucks pulling up to the square. While dew was still wet on the grass, they unloaded folding tables one by one, metal legs clicking into place. That familiar sound set them in rows beneath the sycamores, where light fell in shifting patterns through the leaves. Mrs. Larch directed operations with her usual calm authority, wearing her wide-brimmed straw hat, the one with ribbon faded from blue to almost gray. Over many summers, she'd worn that hat to every outdoor event for as long as anyone could remember. It had become a kind of symbol, a sign that Mrs. Larch was in charge. Things would proceed in orderly fashion. Her dress was patterned with small blue bells that swayed gently as she walked, from table to table, checking arrangements, offering suggestions. She had a clipboard in one hand, pencil behind her ear, though she rarely consulted either. She knew what needed to be done, knew the volunteers knew too. The clipboard was just a prop, a way of looking official. Boxes of books came out slowly, from back of station wagons, trunks of sedans. They were heavy, these boxes, filled with accumulated reading of many lifetimes. Volunteers carried them carefully, 2 hands on each box, stepping slowly across grass to avoid tripping on hidden roots or dips in ground. Mysteries were set beside cookbooks. On one table, old gardening manuals found their places, next to novels with cracked spines, covers worn soft from many hands. A section was devoted to children's books, spines bright with pictures of animals and adventures, waiting for small hands to choose them. A few battered copies appeared of the Milford Junction centennial history, as they always did, as if the book itself had decided to come back each year, regardless of who took it home last time. The centennial had been 23 years ago, but the book kept circulating, passed from one household to another, read or unread, cherished or forgotten. By mid-morning, the square was humming with quiet activity. Neighbors greeted each other with easy familiarity of people who have weathered many seasons. Together, they commented on the heat, on the impressive turnout, on the quality of the donations. This year, conversations were nothing special, just ordinary exchanges of people who had known each other for years. But there was comfort in them, in the predictability, seeing the same faces, hearing the same voices. This was what community felt like, not grand gestures, not dramatic events, just steady accumulation of small moments shared. Children darted between the tables, drawn by the promise of adventure. In a stack of dog-eared paperbacks, they would pull out books with colorful covers, flip through the pages, looking at pictures, reading first few sentences before moving on to the next one. Their attention spans were short. but their enthusiasm was genuine. Mr. Harlan from the hardware store lingered over a box of westerns, picking up each book, examining the cover, with careful attention of a collector. He had a weakness for cowboy stories and outlaws, tales of wide-open spaces, clear moral choices. His own life had been full of complications, but westerns were simple. He liked that. Mrs. Peabody was spotted, tucking a few more romance novels under her arm with a satisfied expression. She claimed to have read every romance novel in the county. She made no apologies for her reading tastes. Romance novels made her happy. At her age, she had decided happiness was reason enough for anything. Sun climbed higher, dappling tables, with shifting patterns of light and shadow, as leaves moved overhead in the breeze, air filled with soft rustle of pages being turned, low murmur of conversation. Somewhere nearby, a mockingbird was running through its repertoire, imitating calls of other birds with impressive accuracy. Around noon, ladies from the Methodist Church arrived with a cooler of lemonade, a tray of molasses cookies. They set up shop near the war memorial, arranging cups and napkins with efficiency of people who had done this many times before. The lemonade was tart enough to make you pucker, made from real lemons, just enough sugar to take the edge off. It was the kind of lemonade that reminded you of childhood, summer afternoons that seemed to last forever, a time when your biggest worry was whether there would be enough cookies to go around. The cookies were soft and chewy, molasses giving them depth of flavor. Plain sugar cookies couldn't match. They stuck pleasantly to your teeth, sweetness lingering on your tongue. Long after the cookie was gone, several people went back for seconds. Nobody judged them for it. The afternoon drifted by in that slow, unhurried way summer afternoons sometimes do. Folks came and went, pausing to chat about weather, or state of their tomato plants, or news from relatives in other towns. Conversations blended together into gentle background hum, punctuated by occasional laughter or sound of a table being moved to a shadier spot. A few clouds gathered in the west, their shapes changing slowly as they moved across the sky. People watched with mild interest, wondering if they might bring rain, but they passed by, without so much as a rumble of thunder. The threat was never serious, just a reminder that even the nicest days carry a hint of uncertainty. The only excitement came when a sudden gust of wind sent a stack of magazines tumbling across the grass. Pages fluttered and scattered. Several people jumped up to chase them, laughing at the absurdity of chasing paper in summer heat. Magazines were gathered up, brushed off, returned to their table, a little worse for wear, but still readable. As shadows lengthened and heat began to ease, tables grew lighter, boxes emptier. Best books had been claimed early, but there were still plenty of good finds. For the patient browsers, treasures hiding among the ordinary, waiting to be discovered. Children sprawled on the grass with their new books, already lost in stories of adventure and magic. Their parents sat nearby, on blankets or lawn chairs, watching with quiet satisfaction of people who had successfully introduced their children to the pleasure of reading. The grown-ups lingered too, reluctant to let go of the easy company, the soft golden light. The afternoon had been pleasant, in a way hard to define, but easy to feel. Nothing remarkable had happened, yet everything felt just right. Mrs. Larch made her rounds, thanking the volunteers, exchanging a few quiet words with each one. She had a gift for making people feel appreciated, for recognizing the value of small contributions. That made events like this possible. The book sale was her project, but it belonged to everyone who had helped. There was talk of making the outdoor sale a tradition, though someone pointed out it would depend on the weather, as most things do. If next July brought rain, they would move back to the church basement without complaint. But if weather cooperated, they would be back in the square, under the shade of the sycamores, surrounded by books and neighbors, when the last book was packed away and tables folded up. The square returned to its usual quiet. The only sign of the day, a faint patch of flattened grass, a lingering sweetness in the air. That might have been the lemonade, or might have been contentment of a community well spent. Sky streaked with first hints of evening, purple and pink and gold. Along the horizon, cicadas started up again, their steady song filling the air as town settled in for another summer night, the kind that comes soft and slow, with promise of more easy days, waiting just around the corner. Now that the screen has turned fully dark and calm, you can close your eyes, let the day unwind from your shoulders. The stories are settling into quiet now. The night is here to carry you the rest of the way. The book sale has packed up, gone home. The square is peaceful again. Sycamores stand guard over the empty grass, leaves rustling softly in the evening breeze. Fireflies are beginning to appear, tiny lights blinking on and off, in patterns only they understand. Let your breathing slow. Let your body sink a little deeper into wherever you are resting. The stories will be here when you need them again. But for now, there is nothing to do but rest. It was a Thursday morning in late April when the milk truck rolled through Milford Junction, a little earlier than usual. The sound of the engine startled a pair of mourning doves from the edge of the Lutheran church parking lot, sending them fluttering up in a mild commotion. That was over almost before it began. The doves settled on a nearby wire, soft gray feathers ruffled slightly by the unexpected disturbance. They cooed to each other, perhaps discussing the rudeness of trucks. That didn't keep to regular schedules. Then they flew off to find a quieter spot. The driver was a fellow named Hank, who had been delivering milk and the occasional carton of orange juice to the same handful of porches for so long. Folks had stopped noticing the sound of his engine altogether. It had become part of the background noise of early morning, as familiar as the birds or the distant bark of a dog. Hank knew every house on his route by heart, knew which porches had steps that creaked, which had dogs that liked to investigate, the milk bottles, knew which customers wanted milk left on the front porch, which preferred the side door, knew who would be awake to wave, who would still be sleeping, curtains drawn against early light. But that morning he was ahead of schedule by a good 15 minutes, which in a town like Milford Junction was enough to throw off the rhythm of things in small and mostly invisible ways. The difference was felt more than noticed, a slight shift in the usual sequence of morning sounds. The sun was just beginning to warm the dew off the grass. Air had that hopeful dampness that comes after a night of soft rain. The rain had been gentle, just enough to settle the dust, freshen the lawns, without creating puddles or flooding anyone's basement. The kind of rain everyone agreed was exactly what the gardens needed. Tulips in Mrs. Eberhardt's yard were standing a little taller than they had the day before. Petals were still closed, waiting for sun to reach them properly before they opened. But you could see the color inside, hints of red and yellow and pink. That would soon brighten the whole flower bed. Robins were already at work on their eternal project of finding worms. They hopped across lawns with purposeful movements, pausing now and then to tilt their heads, listen for something moving beneath the soil. When they heard what they were listening for, they would plunge their beaks into the ground with sudden force, come up with something wriggling. There was a faint smell of earth and laundry soap drifting from somewhere. The earth smell came from rain-softened ground, rich and dark and full of promise. The laundry soap smell came from Mrs. Hendricks, down the street, already running her first load, basement windows open to let out the warm air. The only other sound was distant clatter of the newspaper boy's bicycle, making his way up Maple Avenue. He was running a little behind, which was unusual for him, but nobody minded. Newspapers would arrive when they arrived. News they contained would be the same, whether you read it at 6:30 or 7, now in a place like Milford Junction. People tend to keep to their routines. Same things happen at same times each day. The pattern becomes a kind of comfort. You don't have to think about what comes next, because what comes next is always the same as what came before. Even the smallest change can ripple out in unexpected ways, though usually the ripples are so gentle nobody notices them. A milk truck arrives 15 minutes early. Suddenly the whole morning shifts slightly, like a picture nudged out of alignment. That morning, because Hank was early, Mrs. Eberhardt came out to fetch her milk before she had put on her house shoes. She stood for a moment on the porch, in her stocking feet, blinking at the sunlight, feeling the damp wood cool against her toes. The sensation was not unpleasant, just unexpected. She found herself pausing to notice it, in a way she might not have otherwise. She waved at Hank, who tipped his cap called out a greeting. Before climbing back into his truck, the truck pulled away with its familiar rattle, heading down the street to the next porch, and Mrs. Eberhart bent to pick up the bottles. As she did, she noticed something. The tulips by the steps were showing color. The buds that had been green and closed for the past week were beginning to split open, revealing bright petals inside. She had planted these bulbs last fall, pushing them into cold soil with her bare hands, wondered during the long winter whether they would come up at all. But here they were, right on schedule, doing what tulips do. The sight of them made her smile. She stood for a moment longer. On the porch, milk bottles cold against her hip, just looking at the flowers, and the morning light, and the way the world was quietly going about its business. The morning moved forward in its usual way, though perhaps a beat or two out of its familiar rhythm. Newspaper boy finished his route, headed home for breakfast. School bus made its rounds, stopping at corners where children waited, with backpacks and lunch boxes. Shops along Main Street opened their doors, proprietors sweeping sidewalks, setting out their signs. At the Milford Junction Feed and Grain, old Mr. Leland was already sweeping the entryway in his usual slow circles. He had been sweeping this same entryway for more than 40 years. The motion had become so automatic, he hardly thought about it anymore. Broom moved in long, even strokes, gathering dust and stray bits of grain that had drifted in from the loading dock. He would pause now and then to lean on the broom, watch the traffic pass, such as it was: a pickup truck with a load of fence posts, a station wagon with a family heading somewhere, the mail truck making first rounds of the day. Mr. Leland would nod to each one as it passed, whether the drivers saw him or not. The rain came sometime around mid-morning, just a light shower. That lasted maybe 15 minutes. Drops tapped gently against windows, gathered on leaves of the maple tree outside the library. Air smelled fresh and clean, the way it always does after a spring rain, with that particular quality that makes you want to take a deep breath and hold it. Mrs. Pritchard had been planning to walk to the hardware store for tomato cages. She decided to wait out the shower at her kitchen table with a second cup of coffee. She didn't mind a little weather, but she had a fondness for quiet moments. That came with a surprise rain. So she sat down with the newspaper, watched the way the drops gathered on the glass, rolled down in slow trails. The newspaper was full of usual things, news from far away. That didn't affect her life in any direct way, but it gave her something to look at while she drank her coffee. Children at the schoolyard paused in their morning recess to watch the puddles form. A few of them extended their hands to catch the raindrops, laughing as cool water spotted their palms. Mrs. Hargrove, the crossing guard, watched them with a fond expression. She had a soft spot for both children and ducks. She believed a little kindness on a rainy morning was worth more than a scolding about wet clothes. The rain brought a different rhythm to the day, slowing the usual bustle, giving everything a kind of gentle pause. At the corner of Main and Willow, traffic light blinked its steady red and green. Cars moved more slowly than usual. Drivers seemed content to wait an extra moment before turning, as if the rain had reminded everyone. There was no need to rush. By midday, rain had eased to a fine mist. Sun began to push through clouds in pale streaks. Puddles on Main Street reflected storefronts and faded red brick of the old firehouse, creating a doubled world that shimmered with each passing car. Air felt soft and cool. Folks who had been waiting out the rain began to emerge from doorways and porches. They blinked at the brightness, commented on how fresh everything looked, the way the rain had washed dust from the leaves, left the sidewalk shining. Mrs. Pritchard finally made her way to the hardware store, stepping carefully around puddles that had formed in low spots of the sidewalk. The bell above the door jingled as she entered. Mr. Glay looked up from the counter with a welcoming nod. She had come for tomato cages, but found they had been moved to make room for a display of garden gnomes. The gnomes stood in a cheerful row, bright hats and painted smiles, incongruous among the tools and hardware that filled the rest of the store. She stood for a moment, considering the gnomes. They were not something she had ever thought of buying, but there was something appealing about their cheerful expressions. They looked like they would be happy wherever you put them, content to stand guard over a flower bed or a vegetable garden or a corner of the yard where nothing much happened. She decided this year she would try something new, selected a gnome with a blue hat and a particularly pleased expression, added it to her purchase, along with the tomato cages. Mr. Glay wrapped it carefully in newspaper, handed it over with a slight smile, as if he understood exactly why someone might suddenly need a garden gnome on a rainy April morning. The town settled into the soft hush that comes after a rain, the kind that makes grass look greener, air feel cleaner. Children at the schoolyard chased each other around the puddles, laughter carrying on the damp air. And for a little while, everything in Milford Junction felt just a bit quieter, a bit softer, as if the rain had given everyone permission to slow down and notice the small comforts of an ordinary day. The evening is getting on now. I find myself wondering about you, wherever you are. How long have you been listening to these stories from Milford Junction? Maybe this is your first night, just getting to know the town and its people, or maybe you've been here before, many times. These voices and places have become familiar friends. Either way, I'm glad you're here. There's something nice about knowing that somewhere out there, someone is listening, settling in for the night, with these quiet stories for company. It doesn't matter if you fall asleep before the end. The stories will be here when you come back. Let us ease into the next part, where the pace gets even slower, the night gets even deeper. It was early spring, just after clocks had sprung forward. Everyone still feeling a little off-kilter from the lost hour. Mornings were lighter now, but the change came with a cost. For a few days everyone walked around, looking slightly confused, as if they weren't quite sure what time it really was. The old weather siren, on top of the fire hall, had been silent since previous autumn, when it had let out a mournful groan during a storm, and then given up entirely. The siren had been there since the 1950s, a relic of an era when weather warnings came from the sky rather than from phones and televisions. For decades it had sounded at noon, every day, a single long wail. That told everyone in town what time it was. People set their watches by it. Businesses scheduled lunch breaks around it. It was as much a part of Milford Junction as the water tower or the church steeple. But now it was gone. The town had grown quiet at noon, in a way that felt strange and incomplete. People would look up at 12 o'clock, expecting to hear the familiar sound, then remember it wasn't coming. The silence felt like an absence, a missing tooth in the smile of the day. The town council, after much discussion and a few gentle arguments about tradition and progress, had voted to replace it. Some members thought the siren was outdated. People had other ways of knowing time, getting weather warnings now. But others pointed out the noon whistle was a tradition, part of what made Milford Junction feel like Milford Junction. Some traditions were worth keeping, even if they weren't strictly necessary. The new siren arrived on a Tuesday, hauled in on a flatbed truck from a company somewhere to the south. It was a sleek thing, painted a bright, hopeful yellow. That looked almost out of place against faded brick of the fire hall. The old siren had been gray and boxy, but this one had curves, a modern look. That suggested it knew things the old siren had never dreamed of. Folks gathered to watch as it was hoisted up to the roof, the process taking most of the morning. Workers moved carefully, mindful of the height and the spring wind that kept gusting at inconvenient moments. Mr. Larrabee from the hardware store offered advice from the sidewalk, pointing out things the workers had probably already considered, but that Mr. Larrabee felt compelled to mention anyway. Mrs. Jensen brought out a plate of oatmeal cookies for the workers, same cookies she brought to every community event. The cookies were slightly dry, as they always were, but nobody complained. It was the gesture that mattered, the recognition that these workers were doing something for the town, deserved a little appreciation. The installation went smoothly enough, but the question of when to test it became a matter of some debate. In the past, the old siren had been tested at noon on the first Wednesday of every month, a tradition so woven into the fabric of Milford Junction that people planned around it. But the new siren, according to the manual, had a variety of tones and settings, tones for different kinds of emergencies, tornadoes and severe thunderstorms, and other threats. There was talk of trying out each one, just to make sure they all worked. This led to a meeting of the Emergency Preparedness Committee, which, like most committees in town, was made up of the same handful of people who seemed to find themselves on every committee. They met in the basement of the library, where folding chairs were a little too low. Coffee pot was always just finishing a fresh brew. After much discussion, it was decided The test would take place at noon, as always, but only one tone would be used to avoid confusing anyone who might think a real emergency was happening. The news went out in the weekly bulletin. Mrs. Carver at the post office made sure to mention it to everyone who came in for mail. Morning of the test dawned bright and chilly, with a breeze that carried the smell of thawing earth and last year's leaves. People went about their business, with one ear tuned to the clock. At the grocery, Mrs. Dugan lingered over the apples, chatting with Mr. Patel about whether new siren would be louder than the old one. At the school, children were led out onto the playground a few minutes early so they could listen. At the bank, Mr. Harlan paused in the middle of counting nickels to glance at the big clock on the wall when the hour struck. There was a moment of quiet anticipation. The town seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the sound that would tell them the new siren worked, that the noon whistle tradition would continue, that some things at least would stay the same, even as others changed. Then the siren began. The sound was different from the old one, higher in pitch, somehow more insistent, but it was still recognizably a noon whistle. It rose and fell in a long wail that echoed off the buildings downtown, carried out across the fields to the edge of town. People paused to listen, tilting their heads slightly, the way dogs do when they hear an unfamiliar sound. Children on the playground covered their ears but smiled, recognizing this was an event, something to remember. Dogs in the neighborhood barked for a moment, then settled, accepting the new sound, as they would eventually accept anything that repeated often enough. The sound lasted about 30 seconds. Then it faded away, leaving behind a silence that felt different from the silence before. It was a satisfied silence, a silence that came after something had been completed, rather than one waiting for something to begin in the following weeks. The new siren became familiar. People stopped noticing the difference in pitch, stopped commenting on how it wasn't quite the same as the old one. It sounded at noon every day, just as the old siren had. People set their watches by it, scheduled lunch breaks around it, just as they always had. Some things change, some things stay the same. The trick is knowing which is which. The noon whistle was one of those things that needed to stay the same, even if the machine that made the sound was different. The tradition was not about the siren itself, but about what the siren represented, the steady marking of time, in a place where time moved slowly and gently as spring advanced and days grew warmer. The noon whistle became part of the background again, just another sound in the symphony of small-town life, and the old siren, wherever it had ended up, rusted quietly in some corner, its work done, its voice replaced by something newer, but carrying on the same old song. If you listen closely to the sound of a broom sweeping a porch in the early morning, you might notice how it changes with the seasons. In Milford Junction, the bristles drag a little slower. In the dampness of late April, when air is thick with the promise of rain, and robins are just starting to get bold about their singing. The sweep of the broom is a soft hush against the old wooden boards, a rhythm repeated so many times it has worn smooth grooves into the grain of the wood. Sometimes the sound is joined by the distant clink of a spoon in a mug, or the faint creak of a screen door. That has seen more springs than anyone cares to count. On such a morning, the town is not quite awake, but not quite asleep either. The world feels like it's holding its breath, waiting for the first real warmth to settle in and stay. The light has that soft quality that comes before sun fully commits to rising a pale gray, that turns everything gentle and indistinct. At the edge of town, where maples lean over Maple Street in a way that suggests they're sharing secrets with each other, Mrs. Edna Larrabee was sweeping her porch with a kind of slow determination. She had always been particular about her porch, not so much the inside of her house, which was a comfortable jumble of knitting baskets and old seed catalogs and newspapers she meant to read, but never quite got around to. But the porch was her stage, the place where she greeted the world each morning, watched it settle down each evening. She liked it to look just so. The porch wrapped around two sides of the house, boards painted a gray that had faded over years to something closer to silver. Paint was peeling in places. Every spring Edna thought about having it redone, but every spring something else seemed more pressing. The porch remained as it was, a little shabby but still standing. The trouble this spring was the wind, which had been especially mischievous, tossing last year's leaves into corners she'd already swept twice that week, carrying in little twigs from the neighbor's birch tree that scattered across the boards like pickup sticks, waiting for a player. Edna didn't mind the work. The sweeping gave her something to do with her hands, while her mind wandered over the day ahead. But she did mind the notion that the wind seemed to have singled her out, leaving neighbors' porches relatively clean, while piling debris at her door. She had mentioned this to Mr. Harlan, who lived across the street, in the house with the blue shutters. He was a retired mail carrier, with a fondness for sitting in his front window, watching the world go by. He spent most of his mornings there, cup of coffee in one hand, newspaper in the other, keeping track of the neighborhood with the same attention he had once given to his mail route. Harlan had nodded gravely at her complaint, said that the wind was a trickster. In April, would settle down once the lilacs bloomed. It was the kind of thing old-timers said, the kind of folk wisdom. That might be based on years of observation, or might be entirely made up. Either way, Edna liked the sound of it. The wind will settle when the lilacs bloom, she repeated to herself as she swept. The words had a nice rhythm, like a line from a poem, or a snatch of an old song. She didn't know if it was true, but she wanted it to be. Sometimes wanting was enough. The morning was cool, smelled of wet earth. The faint tang of last night's rain. The sky was a pale gray. That promised more of the same, though whether that meant more rain or just more grayness was hard to say. Robins were out in force, hopping across lawns with their characteristic tilt-headed alertness. The only real activity on the street was the slow crawl of a pickup truck belonging to Pete Glay, the town's part-time handyman. Pete was making his rounds, checking sump pumps and gutters for folks who were not as spry as they used to be. His truck moved at a pace that suggested he had nowhere particular to be, which was more or less true. He waved as he passed Edna's house. She lifted her broom in reply. The gesture had become a kind of ritual between them, a small acknowledgment that they had seen each other. The day was proceeding as expected. It wasn't much, as far as human connection went, but it was something. It was enough. Across the street, Harlan's tabby cat, Mabel, was making her own inspection of the sidewalk. Mabel was a dignified creature, orange and white fur. She kept meticulously groomed, a particular way of walking that suggested she owned everything she surveyed. She paused every few feet to sniff at something invisible to human eyes, nose working with concentration of a scientist examining specimens. The cat's slow progress was a kind of weather report in itself. If Mabel was willing to leave the porch, it meant the air was gentle. The world was safe for exploring. Edna watched her for a moment, then went back to her sweeping. Her mind drifted to the committee meeting scheduled for later that afternoon. At the community center, the Ladies' Improvement Society was supposed to decide on the color of the new curtains for the main hall, a matter that had already inspired more discussion than the town budget. Edna had her heart set on pale yellow, the color of the first daffodils that came up each spring by the war memorial. But she suspected Mrs. Kittredge would push for blue, as she always did. Mrs. Kittredge had blue curtains in her own home, seemed to believe. What was good enough for her parlor was good enough for anywhere. The meeting would be long, full of polite disagreement. Coffee served in chipped mugs. That had been there since the building opened. Someone would bring a plate of cookies, probably oatmeal. Someone else would claim they were store-bought, even though everyone knew they were not. The weather would be discussed at length, and the state of the church roof, and the rumor that the hardware store might start closing an hour earlier on Saturdays. Edna found these meetings both exhausting and comforting, a reminder that small things mattered, even if only because they gave people something to talk about. As the morning wore on, the town began to stir more fully. A few cars rolled down Main Street, drivers waving to each other through the windows in that automatic way of people who had been doing it for years. The bakery opened its doors, let out a warm, yeasty smell that drifted all the way to Edna's porch, promising fresh bread and cinnamon rolls and all the small pleasures that came with them. Somewhere a radio was playing softly, the local station, with its endless stream of farm reports. and lost dog announcements. Farm reports were the same every day. Prices for corn and soybeans, things that Edna didn't grow and didn't understand. But the sound of them was familiar, a kind of background music. That had been playing for as long as she could remember. The wind picked up again, swirling a handful of maple seeds across the porch, undoing some of Edna's careful work. The seeds spun in lazy circles, their papery wings catching the air. Before settling in the corner, she had just swept. She paused and leaned on her broom, watching them. With an expression more resigned than annoyed, she thought about letting them be, just this once. They were only seeds after all, would blow away again as soon as the wind shifted, but habit won out, as it usually did. She swept them into a neat pile with the rest. The clouds shifted overhead. A brief patch of sunlight found its way through, lighting up the porch rail, making the old paint look almost new. The warmth felt good on Edna's face. She closed her eyes for a moment, just feeling the sun and the breeze and the particular peace of a morning that asked nothing of her. She smiled to herself, thinking maybe Harlan was right about the lilacs after all. Maybe the wind would settle soon, and the porch would stay clean for more than an hour at a time. Or maybe it wouldn't, and that would be all right too. The sweeping gave her something to do. The wind gave her something to talk about. Between the two of them, they filled the morning hours well enough across the street. Mabel the cat had settled herself on a warm patch of sidewalk, eyes half closed, tail flicking in a slow rhythm that suggested contentment. Pete's truck had disappeared around the corner, off to the next house on his list. The only sound was the gentle hush of the broom against the boards. The morning moved on in its own unhurried way. The town of Milford Junction settled into another day, not remarkable in any particular way, except that it was theirs, and that was enough. The evening has grown deep around us now. Stories are winding down, like the last slow turns of a music box. The town of Milford Junction is settling in for the night. Lights going off in windows, one by one, streets growing quiet and still. We have visited many corners of this town tonight, met many of its people, watched them go about their gentle business. We have seen clouds watched, and letters written, porches swept, and books sold, rain falling, and sirens sounding. Small things, all of them, but small things are what life is made of, mostly. The accumulated sense of the place has settled around us like a comfortable blanket. The sounds of it, the lawn mowers, the cicadas, the train whistles, that may or may not still echo through the years, the smells of it, the lilacs, the cut grass, the coffee brewing in the post office, the feel of it, the worn wooden porch boards, the smooth handles of old cups, the cool morning dew beneath stocking feet. This is what a town is, not buildings and streets, but moments and memories, small kindnesses, and quiet routines, repeated until they become invisible, until they become the very texture of life itself. The evening is fully settled now. The moon is up there somewhere, whether you can see it or not.